Good morning. Welcome. For those of you who were not able to join us at yesterday's welcome plenary for the Diversity and Inclusion Summit here at Brown. For those of you I haven't yet met, my name is Lisa Cariagalo. I'm the Vice President for Academic Development, Diversity and Inclusion. And on behalf of Brown, we welcome you to this second day of the summit. I know that others will be making their way here shortly, but in the interest of time, certainly, although we built in some time during coffee breaks to sort of seep into the coffee break should we need it, we thought it would be advisable just to start. And I know you're very excited to hear from our speaker and panelists this morning. So, yesterday, at the welcome plenary keynote address, Earl Lewis, the president of the Mellon Foundation, both inspired and I think challenged us to consider the following: that history matters, and that we must understand fully how national policies, institutional structures, and societal norms over time have shaped our conceptions of diversity and inclusion, not just in our institutions, but in a larger way in American society today. He also posed the following algorithm: that equity should not be diversity plus inclusion, but rather that equity should equal diversity times inclusion. So diversity and inclusion is not simply additive, but interactive and relational always, and viewed through a social justice lens, not just through a welcoming lens. I hope that you will keep that in mind as you think about and consider all of the different concepts, ideas, practices, program policies that our panelists this morning, but our panelists and speakers throughout the day will be discussing with you. I hope that, as I said yesterday, this is not about listening to best practices or even hearing narratives. It is about our collective engagement in this work, that this labor of diversity and inclusion invites us individually and collectively to be part of this work. And that now more than ever, we must take a stand. We must be present for this work around diversity and inclusion. We also understand that diversity and inclusion means engaging in this work in an intersectional way, in the intersectionality of identities that are both visible and invisible. So as much as some of us will be talking about race, ethnicity, and gender, and even to some extent disabilities, and how technologies might influence our approach to this work, we also must recognize that there are identities that are not always visible or known or disclosed, and that we must also be fully able to hear and to listen and to learn about individuals' approach to how they choose to disclose their identities and how that matters in the work that they do at higher education institutions. So Earl Lewis closed with really 3 questions that I hope you'll keep in mind as we have our conversations with one another throughout the day. And I hope that you'll engage people, particularly people whom you may not yet have met. And so if you're sitting with the same group of people that you sat with last night, you should find other people to sit with today. And there'll be multiple opportunities to sit with different people throughout the day. So please try to meet new people from the many institutions that are represented here at the summit. So the 3 questions that President Lewis asked us to consider was, first, how do we define diversity in all its complexity? How do we leverage diversity in our institutions? And finally, how do we truly value diversity and inclusion in higher education? Today's many speakers will speak from their vantage points as thought leaders, innovators, and expert practitioners who have engaged fully the issues of diversity and inclusion in higher education today. They will invite us to be in conversation with them. I've told them and gave them explicit permission that they must compel you to talk. But also to have an opportunity to more fully define and leverage and truly value diversity, so that we can bring about an understanding and acknowledgement of how academic excellence can only be fully achieved if diversity and inclusion is embedded in our conceptions of excellence. Inclusive excellence is a principle that we must uphold as higher education institutions. You'll hear about programs which have shaped the diversity of the academic pipeline, such as the UNCF Mellon Program, the UMBC Meyerhoff Scholars Program, College Horizons. You'll hear about effective policies and practices for accessibility resources, new technologies and innovations that invite us to create more inclusive communities. And you'll hear about the scholarship that ask us to think critically about how we sustain faculty and students through mentoring and intentional community building and networking efforts. Most of all, I hope that you'll hear from our speakers some of their own narratives, the ways in which they have come to this work, the ways in which they have been able to more fully make visible the narratives, the stories, the different approaches that they have taken to this path towards inclusive excellence. This morning's plenary session is inspired by the work of one of Brown's own. And I was delighted when she contacted me when the summit came out, the summit announcement came out, because once I heard from her, I knew she was the perfect person to lead us off this morning. Professor Natasha Warriku is an expert on the relationships between education, racial and ethnic diversity, and cultural processes in schools and universities. Her most recent book, The Diversity Bargain and Other Dilemmas of Race, Admissions, and Meritocracy at Elite Universities, illuminates how undergraduates attending Ivy League universities, like this, and Oxford University conceptualize race and meritocracy. The book emphasizes the contradictions, moral conundrums, and tensions on campus related to affirmative action and diversity, and how these vary across racial and national lines. Her first book, Balancing Acts, Youth Culture in the Global City, analyzes youth culture among children of immigrants attending low-performing high schools in New York City and London. Balancing Acts won the Thomas and Zanecki Best Book Award from the American Sociological Association's International Migration section. Her first book, I think, also is a book that we all should read, especially in these times, as we think about the work that we must do to support our students with different immigration statuses in our institution. Following Professor Warriku's presentation, we will have a group of discussants from Brown, remarkable individuals whom I'm delighted to introduce. First, we have Dr. Mary Grace Almendrez, Assistant Vice President for Campus Life and Dean of Students here at Brown. As Assistant Vice President of Campus Life and Dean of Students, Mary Grace oversees a number of critical departments that invite diversity and inclusion work and provide support to so many of our diverse students. The Brown Center for Students of Color, the International Student and Visitor Experience Office, the LGBTQ Center, and the Sarah Doyle Women's Center, to name a few. Throughout her career, and especially during her time at Brown, Mary Grace has provided leadership and strategic planning for the Division of Campus Life with a focus on student advocacy, support, and response. Finally, but certainly not least, we have two incredible seniors from Brown who are busy, I think, trying to just experience the last semester as fully as possible. We're delighted that they're here with us today. So first, to my immediate right, Emily Dolio, class of 17, concentrator in international and comparative political science. I first came to know Emily as a leader and a founder of the first Gen Z Brown, and I can honestly say that without leaders like Emily, we would not have a FLY Center, First Generation Low Income Center, here today. And to her right, Nancy Trong, class of 17, concentrator in health and human biology and ethnic studies. Nancy is a member of our Diversity Advisory Board here at Brown, but she's also been a leader at the Brown Center Students of Color as a minority peer counselor, and in so many numerous ways, Nancy has created the kind of inclusive communities, not just for her fellow students, but indeed for many of our staff and faculty as well. And I truly appreciate the work that Emily and Nancy have given to Brown and that they'll continue to do as alumni after May. So thank you, Emily and Nancy, for all the work you've done in the time that you've been here. So with that, I'd like to invite Professor Warriku to give her presentation. Please give her a warm welcome.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for this opportunity and for being here. It's really a treat for me it's always a treat for me to come back to the Brown campus and to Providence. So I really welcome this opportunity. And I'm especially excited today to talk with you about my book, in part because I worked hard on it for many years, and I want to share with you what I found, and I think it's some really important things for us to think about, but also because, in particular, on the Brown campus, because you'll hear the voices of Brown students in this book. The book is about how students at elite universities in both the United States and Britain think about both race and meritocracy, and you'll see kind of the intersection between these two, and the ways that that students think about race, how that shapes how they think about fairness and equity and inclusion. And I focus in on views on affirmative action as kind of the intersection of these two issues. And you'll see it's a broader look at admissions and inequality in particular. And what I really care about is how we might think about shifting the way that we address race, class, and achievement to more accurately reflect the opportunity structure that we have in the United States and our racial realities. And for me, that's kind of what I care about and what I hope this book and these findings kind of lead us to a conversation about. And so I'm going to speak for a little bit, and then invite the respondents. I would love to hear what all of them have to say about some of these findings. So let me just tell you about the evolution of this book. As with most books, probably, this grew out of in part out of my own biography. I grew up in a small steel town in Pennsylvania. My parents are immigrants from India. I won't tell you how that happened, but just to say that, I felt very alienated as a kid, and especially as a teenager. And, I think at the time you just think that that's what teenagers are. It's a sort of teenage angst. But it was only really when I arrived to the Brown campus in this, diverse, not as diverse as today probably, but a diverse campus. And it was here that I really developed the language and the kind of framework to really understand the ways in which I was excluded. And experienced racial exclusion in my childhood. When I got here, we talked endlessly about race, about ethnic identities, our identities, about so many things related to diversity. And I imagine that's true for many undergraduates even today. So this was my first kind of window into the way that higher education might shape the way that we think about race. And then fast forward to my 30th birthday, I moved to London. And when I moved there, I kind of knew that, we think of the US as a very kind of race-identified society and Britain as a kind of class-identified society, although we have pretty serious class inequality in the United States, and there's also racial inequality in Britain. But this is sort of in the kind of minds of people. So I kind of knew that. And yet, I was often surprised at how willing people were, colleagues at the University of London, friends of my good friend who was a member of the Green Party, so people who kind of saw themselves as liberal for the most part. I was kind of surprised about their willingness to express views that I kind of considered offensive. So there would be discussions about, should arranged marriage be banned in Britain? And, my parents and all the elders in my family have had an arranged marriage. I thought, well, okay, what's the big deal, right? Has British multiculturalism gone too far? Is Islam compatible with Britishness? These questions, so I was surprised that people were asking these questions, and I was even more surprised that they were talking about them in front of me. Someone who is of Indian origin. And so, and I noticed that on the University of London campus that I was a faculty member of, we didn't talk, there was no talk of inclusion, of diversity, of access, and I, started to understand that higher education played a very different role in terms of these questions in Britain. So I really became curious about how higher education shapes our perspectives on race. And, on the Brown campus, I think Brown has been especially a leader in thinking about these issues and institutionalizing these issues through I still call it the Third World Center. The Brown Center, and I call it the Third World Center of the book because that's what it was called when I did this research. The Brown Center for Students of Color, there's now a First Generation Student Center, we have there's an African American Studies department. Many universities, residential universities, have ethnic studies as well. Brown also has Rights and Reasons. There are all of these institutionalized ways in which we support diversity, and in Britain, really, none of that really exists. So I was curious about how this might shape students' perspectives differently across these national contexts. And at the same time, I was really thinking a lot about inequality. So this is showing up, right? Okay. I can't see it, but I can see it here. So I was thinking about growing inequality. And so, Lisa mentioned my first book, which was on children of immigrants in low-performing high schools. And I started to think, well, we always think of inequality in terms of disadvantage. But what about privilege? And how does privilege perpetuate inequality? We know that the United States and Britain are highly unequal societies. So if you look at I know this slide, if you just look at the horizontal axis, that's a measure of income inequality. So the ratio between people who are at the 90th percentile of incomes and the people who are at the 10th percentile of incomes, and that relationship, that is quite different, the 90th and 10th in the United States compared to all the other OECD countries, which are the countries on the left, only surpassed by mostly by emerging economies on the right. And if you look at the vertical axis, that is a measure of intergenerational mobility. So how correlated is your income to the income of your parents? And you can see, again, the United States and Britain are higher than all other OECD countries, so similar kinds of countries. And so we know that these are two societies in which incomes are highly unequal, and there's less mobility than we tend to think. We tend to think that we're in this land of equal opportunity, but in fact, there's less mobility than in similar countries. So we know that, and so then how do we make sense of this and our ideas about opportunity? We have a lot of inequality by race as well. This is median worth, that is kind of assets, and median household worth for whites is 13 times greater that of Black Americans and 10 times greater that of Latino Americans. So a lot of racial inequality as well. There's also racial inequality in Britain. Across a variety of measures. And so I integrated these two interests in elite perspectives on inequality. So how do elites kind of make sense, how do elites make sense of their accomplishments in a highly unequal society? And so, how do people reconcile their beliefs with equal opportunity with what we know about inequality? And in particular, how do they make sense of race and racial inequality in particular? And I thought this would give us clues as to why we continue to have social policies that maintain inequality. And so I integrated these two interests in kind of the influence of higher education on students, and in particular on students' ideas about and thoughts about race and understandings of race, with ideas about inequality by examining students' perspectives on college admissions, including affirmative action. And so I focus in on the most elite universities, like places like Harvard and Brown, and in Britain, we talked to students at Oxford, because I wanted to be kind of in the most sympathetic audience, right? I didn't want to be at a university where students would say, well, I would have gotten into Brown, I would have gotten into Harvard if it weren't for affirmative action, right? So these are students who have kind of won, as it were, up to this point in their lives, right? They've gotten into the most elite places, and how do they kind of think about inequality, inclusion, and exclusion, who's on campus, who deserves to be on campus, and who doesn't make it? And so I kind of use students' perspectives as an entree into understanding more broadly how they think about their ideas about the role that race plays in society. And so, how these students think about these issues matters a lot as well, I want to point out, because many of the students will go on to be future leaders in our society. Some will go into, make social policies. Others will maybe join the media and be part of our kind of public discourse. Many students will go on to make hiring decisions in the future and be making decisions about what's an equitable way and a good way to hire people and make choices about, again, deservingness and merit on the job. And so these students' perspectives matter a lot. Okay. So, and the second question, how do the national university context shape that meaning making? I'm going to focus in on the United States for the rest of this talk, just to sort of narrow in, and I'll talk a little bit about the differences between Harvard and Brown, and how they shape students' perspectives as well, as a way to sort of think about how we might do this work differently in the future. So let me just say a little bit about admissions. Most of you will know that admission to places like Brown and other elite universities is super competitive. Admissions rates under 10%. Most students who come here, all students really, the vast majority of their peers are not getting into the university that they're going to, whether it's Harvard, Brown, or other elite institutions. And so most students have worked incredibly hard in high school. And so there's a real kind of sense of accomplishment and a kind of sense of reward for hard work when one gets into an elite university, which is understandable. On the other hand, sorry, I'm confused about which. Right. On the other hand, we know that there is inequality in the outcomes of admissions. So this is, if you look at, some people in admissions might quibble with these data. These are data from when I did this research, so I know that the numbers change from year to year. But at that time, about 15% of Brown students and Harvard students were Black or Latino, compared to about a third of young adults in the United States. 85% of students had a parent who has a bachelor's degree, compared to about a third of American adults. So we see inequality in the outcomes of admissions, and yet there are other kind of signals that students get that this is a meritocratic system. So how do they kind of reconcile these two things? This is the question that I want to focus on, and how does race kind of play into this? Okay, so my research team, we went out and interviewed 143 students across these 3 campuses, undergraduates, and we talked to them about a range of issues: campus life, growing up, beliefs about how the world works, inequality, ethnic and racial identities, and of course admissions, and what admissions should do. So, okay, I'm going to skip over that. So let me tell you now what I found. The first thing that I want to say is that students in both of these national contexts basically say that admissions should be done the way it's actually done, right? So they kind of repeat the language of the admissions office. And, I argue in the book that in doing so, they legitimate a system that produces unequal outcomes, right? And so, and they embrace this process that they know to have these results. And we can understand why they do that, right? Because to call that into question is to call into question their own kind of sense of accomplishment. So I'm going to tell you about 2 aspects of the ways that students in the US kind of thought about admissions, and I'll talk about how race sort of, considerations of race kind of filter through those perspectives. So the first part of admissions in the United States is this idea of a collective merit of the cohort, right? And again, I think this will sound familiar to many of you if you're from the United States and have gone to college at a selective college here, everyone has a hook. And together this cohort makes a diverse group that leads to more learning and a better overall college experience, right? So one person is a musician, another person is good at chemistry, another person is an artist, and we all kind of are part of this collective. Athletics was a part of this. So here's a student at Brown, a white student who said, I used to think that having athletes who are quote unquote less qualified, I no longer view them as less qualified. I view them as qualified in a different way. So you can also hear how the campus experience shapes students' perspectives on this as well, right? After coming to college, they get kind of socialized into a certain way of thinking about fairness. Surprising to me, this kind of logic even applied to students thinking about legacies. About half of students actually said, well, legacy admissions, it's fine because it contributes to this collective. And so here's one student who said, given that people who went to Harvard are much more likely to donate to the university and to continue donating to the university if their children go to Harvard, I think that's a reason to advantage them. She's talking about in admissions. Remember that Harvard in particular has a $30 billion endowment, right? But this idea that, one person brings skills and talents and another person brings money, and it's all part of the collective was very strong and very different from the UK. Now, race becomes part of this idea of a collective merit. So one of the questions we asked students was, should the admissions office consider race or ethnicity in admissions? And then we asked students to elaborate. And the vast majority of students who said yes, which was a majority of students, talked about it as part of this collective merit. So when students all perceive admins to have a kind of hook, then being Black or Latino becomes another form of diversity. So here's a white student who says, ethnic diversity adds as much to the class as someone who's a world-class piano player, and it's just a different sort of diversity to add. So you can hear the kind of problematic kind of commodification of race and ethnicity for Black and Latino students in the minds of their peers. And so I'm going to come back to that and the kind of ramifications of that in a second. But first I want to just tell you about another piece of the ways that students thought about admissions, which is through calibration. And again, this was different from the UK. But students felt that the admissions office should calibrate their evaluations of individuals according to their life circumstances. So let me read you a quote from a student who said, if you had a very hard life, but you did, let's say you got A's and B's instead of straight A's, but you had to work like 20 extra hours a week than another kid, then I think that speaks a lot more than if you got straight A's, because you had to provide for your family or help provide for them. So I think that should be taken into account. So we might think that's a good thing, right? Students are recognizing that we have unequal opportunities and we should pay attention to that. Now, the ways that students talk about race, in the book I talk about something I call race frames, and how the ways that how students understand the role that race plays in social life affects their views on a lot of these issues. So for most white students, they didn't see race as playing a significant role aside from, in terms of inequality, aside from its coincidence with class. So they would say, calibration should be by class, economic situation, and not by race, right? So no recognition of kind of racial inequality independent of class. And so again, when we kind of look at that question of should admissions consider race or ethnicity, students were not talking about opportunity and equal opportunity. Students were thinking about this collective and kind of contributing to the cohort in terms of this. And so, so these are kind of the two pieces, and you see how race kind of intersects with this. And I want to talk now about the consequences of the ways that students think about race in admissions, which is the diversity bargain, and that's the title of the book. The diversity bargain is this, that white students support affirmative action because it leads to personal benefits. And there are three in their own kind of educational experience, because my Brown experience, my Harvard experience is richer because of racial diversity on campus. So I think that's a good thing. rather, and we can imagine alternative narratives, right, which I didn't hear, as I heard a little bit of, more from students of Black and Latino students than from white students, of equity, of unequal opportunities, of reparation for historical exclusion, of a diverse leadership, right? So there are these other narratives that I heard much less often. I really heard this sort of diversity rationale of it creates this broader educational good. And so there are three implications of this diversity bargain that I want to tell you about. I'm going to pull up my book here. And the first implication is that there is this kind of reverse discrimination script that a lot of white students expressed. There's this fear that affirmative action shouldn't, quote unquote, go too far. And this kind of seems to lurk beneath the surface. So I'm going to read you a quote from a student. These are all pseudonyms, of course. A student I call Thomas, who's a white student at Harvard. And he says, I feel personally disadvantaged at times. When you think that they, not lower standards, but that if you're Latino or if you're Black, you could have a lower GPA and lower test scores and get in. And then I could have the same test scores and maybe not get in because there's so many other competitors who might be white that have better test scores. You can kind of feel a bit disadvantaged at times. And here's another student at Harvard who said, if I hadn't gotten into Harvard, I would have felt that I'd been discriminated against. As someone else that I knew who was equally qualified, who was an ethnic minority, had gotten in above me. So there's this idea that, affirmative action shouldn't kind of call into question privilege or a kind of white privilege, right? Or that it should be about benefiting other students rather than a kind of restorative, some kind of restorative justice sort of model. The second piece to this is what I call the integration imperative. If we think of affirmative action as something that builds this diverse community, then there's this expectation that beneficiaries need to integrate into campus life. And there's often an assumption that all Black and Latino students on campus have benefited from this policy. And so if I see a table of Black students or my roommate joining the Latino Students Association, then the students feel upset or kind of question that. So here's a student who said, who talked about how Harvard is a diverse campus, but that it ends up being a lot of different groups kind of hanging out with each other rather than being integrated. And we asked her to elaborate or tell us what she thought about that. And she said, it really bothers me because it makes it really difficult to get to know people, because I'm not in any of those. Like, I'm not going to join the Black Students Association, and most of the groups that I'm in are not, she means race defined. Because if they had a white students association, they'd probably get in a lot of trouble. I think it's just sort of sad because the interaction that I've had with people from different backgrounds has been so great for me, especially coming from a school where there wasn't a lot of that. So there's a few things I want you to notice in this student's words. One is that, of course, she's thinking about what has benefited her and helped her through kind of diversity on campus and lamenting that, she feels like there needs to be more of that. A second piece is a lack of recognition of racial inequality, right? She's kind of equating a Black Students Association with a White Students Association, which means she doesn't have the language to make sense of why we might have a Black Students Association on a campus like this in the first place, and why a White Students Association is a different kind of thing, right? So that inequality. And the third thing here is that, she says very explicitly, I'm not going to join the Black Students Association, right? There's an expectation that students of color enter into white spaces, and not that white students enter into predominantly minority spaces. So that's the kind of integration imperative. And the third consequence of this way of talking and thinking about affirmative action is that it can lead to essentialized conceptions of race and ethnicity. students felt, if there is an expectation that you contribute to this collective merit, then there's sometimes an expectation that you have a particular kind of experience as a Black or Latino student on campus. And so here's a student who said, I don't think because someone checked the Black box or the Latino box that should be what helps get them in. Maybe in their interview you find that since they're Latino, they've done all these things that add something different to the cultural fabric of Harvard. I know people who are like a quarter Mexican who got the Latino Scholars Award, but their entire experience has been a white experience. So this student is defining what it means to be Latino and what it means to be white, and placing their classmate in one of those categories and saying that experience doesn't qualify as a Latino experience. And again, this problematic sort of commodification of people's lived experiences and essentialization of that experience. And so, that the student is not contributing to this kind of what she calls the cultural fabric of the university. And so these three implications, I argue in the book that it makes, on the one hand, this diversity bargain makes white students more willing to support affirmative action than people in the general, affirmative action is much more contested in the broader society than on these campuses. But on the other hand, it has these very troubling implications for the ways that students think about their peers of color, about expectations of their peers of color, their expectations of the university. And it supports this reverse discrimination script. It ignores the hardships that students may face when expected to play a teaching role for their peers on campus. I'm sure many of us have experienced that, like all eyes turn to you when you're the one student of color in the class and you're expected to speak on behalf of, a very diverse group of people. And it also ignores the historical and structural discrimination that continues to face minority children in the United States today. We know that we live in a racially unequal society. And so why wouldn't we have inequality in terms of educational outcomes and want to do something about that, I argue. And so, but this sort of way of thinking about race really blinds students to that. So at this point in the talk, I usually turn to the British case and tell people how the British case is different and how what are the kind of institutional ways that lead to these pathways. But today I thought, since I'm at Brown, there's a chapter in the book that compares the Harvard campus and the Brown campus. And I want to talk to you a little bit about this at this point. And so if we think about, again, I talked about how students kind of build their ways of thinking about race and admissions through how they think about merit and how they think about race. So there's a chapter in the book that I talk about students' race frames. And these race frames are shaped by, their family experiences, K-12 education. There's a lot of work in K-12 education about building students' understandings of race. And then higher education, right? What happens on campus? What signals do they hear on campus? What kinds of ideas are they exposed to? And so that's what I want to talk about. That's what I want to talk about right now, is the sort of way that college shapes students' perspectives on these two campuses. So let me just say that Brown and Harvard are I always get pushback from Brown students when I say this, but Brown grads when I say this, but I'm going to say it. Brown and Harvard are very similar college campuses, attract similar student bodies. I heard the groans. Similar student bodies, but let me just say, the vast majority of college students in the United States are going to non-selective colleges, are commuter students, and in that context, these are very similar universities. Very elite, admissions rates under 10%, similar percentages of international students, of first-generation students, of different minority groups on campus, similar percentages of students on financial aid. So in that context, similar. One big difference, here's the difference, many differences, but one big one is the way that the campuses manage race relations. Brown really has been a leader in this realm, I think, both historically and today as well. So let me just say a little bit about those differences and how I understand them. So Brown, and again, those of you who are affiliated with the university, this will not be new, but Brown has the Center for Students of Color. You know, it used to be called the Third World Center, and you know, and in the renaming, I was pleased to see that the continued emphasis on students of color, right? That this is a center for students of color, and the Third World Center name, I think, also signaled that this is a center, that this is focused in on the needs of those students of color. There's also the Third World Transition Program. For people who haven't heard of that, this is an orientation program before freshman orientation, which is predominantly for students of color, although a handful of white students come every year. And it's and I'll read you, the program talks about addressing, quote, systems of oppression that still exist in the United States today. And another goal is, quote, to introduce new students to the support structures and resources available to them, unquote. And it also talks about building community. So this is a kind of orientation program related to diversity at Brown. Somewhat unique. In 2003, President at the time, Ruth Simmons, established the Committee on Slavery and Justice, which was really looking into how the university profited through or benefited from the slave trade, and has led to the Slavery Memorial on campus, some projects with the local Providence community, and is an ongoing and some ongoing work. And so again, I think one of the first universities to have this kind of commission, and others have, I think, since followed. And lastly, Harambee House is a house focused on African and African American culture that is a residential dorm. And Harvard, now you'll see the parallels at Harvard have a somewhat different kind of tone. So Harvard also has a center. It's called the Harvard Foundation for Intercultural and Race Relations. And historically, and I think still today, this foundation, and the students were pushing for a center for students of color at Harvard, and the universities pushed back, and then said, okay, we're gonna open this foundation, but this is what we're gonna call it. And really focused on integration. So the university really emphasized bringing students together across racial lines. And signaled that in the name, and again, that's still true today. So there, the Harvard Foundation talks about, quote, its goal is, quote, to improve relations among racial and ethnic groups within the university, and to enhance the quality of our common life, and to promote interracial and intercultural awareness and understanding, to highlight the cultural contributions of students from all backgrounds. So again, a very different kind of emphasis. Second, the orientation program around diversity is required of all students at Harvard. It's called Community Conversations. It's a 90-minute discussion during freshman orientation, as opposed to TWTP, which is, I'm forgetting, three days? No. 3.5 days. Thank you, Mary Grace. Last year, so nearly 15 years after Brown's Committee on Slavery and Social and Justice, President Drew Faust established the Committee on Harvard and Slavery. And notice the title as well is different. Brown's committee is on justice, and Harvard. Different name. And lastly, in 2001, Harvard students live in something called houses, and they used to be able to choose which house they lived in. And now, when the university started noticing that black students in particular, there was a lot of sort of sorting by race into houses, and the university said, we don't like this, so we're going to randomize our housing. So you can pick your friends, and then your friends get randomly assigned to a house. Again, to push students to be in integrated kind of settings, as opposed to having a house focused on African and African American culture. Okay, so I'm going to turn to my book again. So what are the implications of these two different models? I'm going to, lost my page. I'm going to focus in on the Third World Transition Program and community conversations. So first, let me say that TWTP really was a kind of seminal experience for many students. They really thought about it really shifted for a lot of them the way that they think about the world. They talked about their worldview shifting. So here's a student who said, if you've never been presented with all these ideas of colonialism and imperialism and how they affect you, you're suddenly like, whoa, here I was just chilling and going to college, and all of a sudden my worldview is rocked, right? And it's a very, and they're saying this in a very positive way, that this, it changed the way they understood the world. And, that was sort of my experience coming to Brown as well, right? That I suddenly understood things that I didn't understand before about my own biography. Another student talked about, there's always, race is something I've always thought about a lot about, and that's been really important to me throughout my life, but coming to TWTP gave me a vocabulary to talk about it. It really concretely explained the difference between interpersonal racism and institutional racism. It just all started to click and make sense. These were very kind of transformative experiences that developed what I call a kind of power analysis race frame for a lot of students, where they understood how racial inequality and the history of racism, colonialism, sexism, all of these kind of systems of oppression shaped life outcomes individually and at the collective level as well. So it built this lens for students who were participating, and students had similar things to say about the Brown Center for Students of Color. On the other hand, students who didn't participate in these institutions felt very alienated from them, in part because they didn't have this lens. And it was not so much about what students were learning and talking about in these institutions, because they didn't really know that if they weren't participating, but that the perception that it separated mostly students of color from white students. So, there was this sort of view this created this unnecessary campus division as in the minds of some of these students who critiqued these programs. So here's a white student at Brown who said, I have a lot of problems with TWTP because it assumes people have more in common with people who have the same skin color as them and people who have the same background. Interestingly, students of color who participated talked a lot about creating a kind of community across racial lines, right? Because of course, students of color are very diverse, right? But white students saw this as a sort of students of color versus white students, sort of in their minds. So it really has real effect of creating fault lines across races in the university. It makes it so that students who went to TWTP got to know each other a week before anyone else came to campus. So when most people can't come onto campus like the rest of the student body, people already have a friend group, and those friend groups have persisted even into sophomore year. So there's, again, this feeling of, again, when you think about that collective merit, this sense of like, well, I need to have access to those students. This is not fair, right? And so, we can critique that on the one hand. On the other hand, we need to think about how do we help students like this student understand why this work is important and why we need those spaces, right? So I think there was less ways for a student like this student to really understand that. And here's another student who says, I think a lot of kids take issue with perceived self-segregation of the TWC. They're talking about the Center for Students of Color. They say, well, I understand what was created in the 60s and 70s to promote acceptance and diversity and solidarity, but now shouldn't the campus just be open? And if you're creating these programs for only one group of people, isn't that out of necessity creating division? And so, again, this feeling of students who aren't participating aren't really understanding why these spaces are important. Okay, so let me say a few words just about Harvard. Harvard really, students thought a lot less about the community conversation. Here's an Asian American student who said, we just talked about everyone had to do this thing called, as freshmen, the community conversation thing. We just talked about the different readings that we had. It wasn't as helpful as I thought it would be. Because when we're forced to talk about diversity, it's not as natural. I didn't leave feeling like, oh my gosh, that was such a life-changing experience. And so, on the other hand, requiring students to participate, as Harvard did, is meant to enhance interracial dialogue, but can kind of stifle it as well if students are feeling forced and aren't really kind of willingly engaging and bringing their full self to this conversation. And it's a short period of time as well during a kind of action-packed orientation schedule. The other piece at Harvard that students talked a lot about was their cultural rhythms performance. This was the biggest event that the Harvard Foundation, is the biggest event that the Harvard Foundation runs every year. It's a kind of multicultural celebration and performances from a lot of different student groups of different ethnic arts groups. And one student said, a white student, cultural rhythms is sponsored by the Harvard Foundation rather than a specific ethnic group. So I think that's a good example of where the existence of ethnic-specific groups really does foster a sort of collective appreciation for diversity. There's 1,000 people who come, and you get to see the South African dance team and the Irish step dancers. All the groups get to perform together on the stage. So for me, that's really a beautiful and powerful picture of the tremendous artistic creativity that every one of these minority groups brings to America. And so, you can hear a very different take on, this is sort of part of this diversity frame, this sort of idea that we all have an ethnic or racial diversity and we bring them all together and we have this rich kind of environment. And I don't want to be misunderstood. I think that that is really important, and there's a whole body of research that shows that the positive impact that diversity has on everybody's learning. But I do think that if we stop there, we lose some of the kind of important reasons why this is a justice issue. So, I conclude in this book in this chapter by saying that we need all of the above. We need celebrations of culture. I think that's a great thing. I love my children's international potluck at their school every year. But we can't stop there. We also need to consider systems of oppression. And we also need interracial dialogue that includes white students and students who are maybe skeptical and who, not just that white student who is going to voluntarily go and enter into, go to TWTP or participate in the Third World Center. We need a broader kind of array. We need, all students to really be thinking and talking about these issues in in-depth ways, and ways that I think, have to go on beyond a 90-minute conversation. And I'll leave it up to all of you, the professionals, to think about what's the best way to do that, because I'm not really sure myself, but maybe others will have some thoughts. So let me just conclude by saying what I think we can do. This is really just a sort of I'm thinking of this as a springboard for conversation. First, teach students about racial exclusion in the United States, historical and ongoing. Students really don't learn about this in school. 20th century American history, where so many supposedly colorblind policies have systematically excluded African Americans, where we have a system in which we have 11 million people who are living with very few legal rights, and this sense of exclusion from American society, even if they've lived here for decades. Students need to understand this, and I think that the more that they gain this understanding, the more likely it is that they will have a different way of thinking about race. Support affinity groups. It's pretty clear that these are essential sources of support for students of color. And to understand, again, I think if students understand the history of racial exclusion, they might better understand why we might need those affinity groups on campus. Third, we need to provide students with opportunities to engage with each other across racial lines, and this is including white students, in productive ways. And, I think just putting students on campus together doesn't mean that they're going to actually engage with each other in productive ways. Intergroup dialogue, I'm sure some of you have heard of this from University of Michigan, is one kind of promising model, I think. There are others. I think, perhaps a diversity-related course requirement, course requirements are anathema at Brown, but if there is a way to make that requirement robust and the kind of course that would qualify, I think that's something for universities to think about. And the last thing I'm going to say is that I think we need to recognize that meritocracy is never complete in an unequal society, right? We are never going to have a completely equal level playing field. It's hard to imagine what that would really look like, right? And given that, we're always going to have some people who get into elite universities and some people who don't go to college, some people go to community college. And then we need to support a broader system of social supports that we have right now. It's very depressing for me to say this given the budget that just came out, but I think it's important to recognize that we can't pretend that if we just get it right, we're going to have a completely fair and equal meritocracy, that this is always going to be a messy kind of work, and that we need to recognize the lived experiences of people who aren't at these kinds of elite places. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm really looking forward to all of your thoughts and all of your thoughts as well. So thank you for listening.
So I'm Emily. I'm a senior. I study international comparative political science. Like Dr. Caraglio said, I wrote the proposal for the First Generation College and Low-Income Student Center, which opened in September, and I founded the student group here for First Gens. I identify as Latinx and First Gen. So I also went to TWCP, so I could respond a little bit to that. I found that it gave me a lot of power, like going into my first year experience, both to use vocabulary to confront my privileges and acts of oppression. So walking into my first year, not coming from like a fancy high school where I had access to that vocabulary, I found that it made my college experience a lot richer.
I'll comment a little bit on the notion of these centers being spaces of self-segregation. There is actually research that shows that students of color integrate into white spaces at much higher rate than white students integrate in student of color spaces. So that argument that students of color aren't out in spaces where they're the minority is actually false. I would also argue that, in particular with our EverTrue alumni, that students who are involved in these kinds of centers actually have a deeper connection to Brown and a deeper love for Brown through and with these spaces. And so in many ways, these spaces become a hub for potential access to Brown, feeling that they belong here, but also strategies for retention for students of color and other marginalized communities. When I think about the BCSC in particular, formerly the TWC, when I was the director a few years ago, we actually did go to Harvard and we visited the Harvard Foundation to look at different models of centers. So we visited the Harvard Foundation, which we were told from the very beginning, this is not a TWC. We chose very consciously not to be a TWC. And we also visited Yale to look at ethnic-specific centers to see how can these spaces be that are primarily focused on ethnic-specific groups, how do they also collaborate and work with one another? And what we found was that the TWC, BCSC, is this very special place that I think synergizes the work that was going on both at Harvard and at Yale in a very particular way. Number one, just like those centers, they are a place to build community across difference, and within intra and inter-ethnic connections. But they weren't solely just for food, folks, and fun. So it was very clear that there was a moral imperative. There was also an educational imperative, that the BCSC was founded on frameworks of intersectionality and critical pedagogy, so that there was an expectation that students would unpack these really complicated issues going on in their lived experiences and in historical experiences. So this opportunity to develop a critical consciousness was sort of it's an expectation in the BCSC that you're going to meet different people, you're going to act with different groups, but you're also going to develop a critical consciousness. And then furthermore, that critical consciousness should be applied in praxis. That as you develop your leadership skills, your expectation is that you take those skills outside. And so you serve your respective communities in whatever form makes most sense for you, right? So this opportunity to build connections with others who are similar and different from you, flex your leadership muscle, and then take that out into the world in support of the academic mission was something that we found very special at the center. And moreover, this legacy of student activism was also different. Harvard, for instance, as Natasha had referenced, was founded by administrators. And that was very clear. And they also said that it was a moment where administration said, we needed this for the students. Well, the center was founded because of demands from students, right? So that's even from there, as a jump-off point, the centers would already be fundamentally different because of the ways in which they were conceptualized.
I'll just say a few things and then we can open it up. So I appreciate both of your comments. I just want to say that I totally see that you know, I think you're right, there's all this research that shows that students of color are integrating, right? And I think what happens is white students notice the table of students of color, but don't notice all those other tables of white students in the cafeteria, right? So why are all the white students sitting together in a cafeteria, right? Should be like the title of another book. You know, and so my question is, how do we develop that? How do we help white students see that, right? Because they have a different lens. They're not seeing that. How do we help them see it? I guess that's my first question. And my second question is, this Brown model is clearly pretty special, right? And you've done this work of kind of going to different places. How do we think about expanding that? Like if someone from Harvard came, I don't know if there's anyone from Harvard here today, besides me, but it came and said, well, you know, we get there are all these great things that are happening. How do we replicate this in different places? And what would that look like? So I don't know if we want to open it up or if the two of you want to jump in or whatever you love to your
Anyone want to comment or ask further questions?
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Madevagi, and I work with the Leadership Alliance, but I also teach here at Brown in the School of Public Health. And I was thinking about some of the comments that you made in terms of teaching this, and the obvious thing is incorporating it into the curriculum or into different classes, having these discussions in our classes. And I wanted to hear some of your thoughts about how to integrate some of these concepts in our classes as we're teaching different subjects so they can see how it intersects with a lot of the wonderful things that students are learning here on our various campuses.
Yeah, that's a good question. A student is just finishing her dissertation on this question about teaching about race in the classroom. So I think that it's going to vary depending on what the subject matter is. But I think, you know, if I think about my own experiences at the School of Education at Harvard, you know, we do have students saying a lot of the time that, you know, in our classes, we have like the diversity week, and then that's it. Or something bubbles up, and then it gets squashed down. So part of this is just faculty's sort of willingness to engage in these issues and feeling comfortable, right? Because I think for a lot of faculty, like, this is hard, right? I mean, it's hard for me, and I study this stuff, and I'm a person of color, and I've thought about this for many years of my life. But I think, especially for faculty who don't feel as comfortable or haven't engaged in these conversations or haven't had the need to in the same way because of their own background, then I think we need to first start with, like, faculty, like, maybe talking with each other and having faculty discussion groups and being very open about, like, okay, this is about how do I kind of think and talk about this issue? Let's look at our syllabi. Like, what's the content of my syllabus? How do I just, like, what is, and I think, you know, there's no sort of magic bullet, but having a kind of open stance, expecting students to engage and to be present in the conversation. But I think that it's when we have these sort of, you know, my student in her dissertation talks about this idea of brave community. We need to foster this brave community among students in the classroom. And, you know, she sort of outlines how to do that. But I think, you know, it involves being willing to put ourselves out there as faculty, right? Because if we don't do it, we don't model it for the students, they're not going to be able to do it either. And I also think we need to create the space, right? So again, I think it really depends on what the subject matter is that you're teaching. And the last thing I'll say is that we need to listen to the students, because students will tell you, right? Like, or at least they'll write on the evaluation if they don't feel like they can say it in class, right? About, like, when, you know, what issues there were or what came up. And I think we need to listen carefully to what they have to say.
I'm also curious to hear maybe more from professors, because I think it's super great to think about how professors could integrate ideas of inequality in their current curriculum. But from my perspective, I'm having a hard time with professors who don't even acknowledge that inequality exists in the first place, right? Like, I'm in political science. I still have professors who are making jokes about the border wall. So I'm like, how am I supposed to pay attention in class when I literally am like worried about the safety of my loved ones and y'all think it's funny? So like that first step, to me, I think we need to get there also.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation and the work that you've done. Your research is very important. I'm Cynthia Neal-Smith. I'm director of the UNCF Mellon programs, and I'm based at Spelman College as a faculty member. So I'm wondering, in addition to the intentionality around intercultural group dialogues and trying to assist faculty and students in learning more about communities of color, how much intentionality has been placed on really talking about white privilege and introducing faculty and students to the scholarship on white privilege so that we begin to interrogate white privilege as a background for then understanding intercultural dialogue and communities of color and structural constraints and structural oppressions.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's so essential. And when I talk about kind of bringing white students into the conversation, I think that has to be part of it. And that, I feel like this notion of white privilege has gotten a little bit of traction in the last few years, but it's very new. And I think, I started this project because I thought we always talk about disadvantage, but we never talk about privilege, right? But without no privilege, there's no disadvantage, right? So I think I think that that's incredibly important, to think about how do we do that in ways that, I also think we need to figure out how to do this in ways that students will be open and be willing to hear, right? It's hard to hear, like, we all have different levels of privilege and disadvantage in our lives, but it's hard to hear when you have privilege, right? And when someone calls you out on that. But how do we do that? How do we have that conversation in productive ways, in ways that really help students understand their position? So yeah, thank you for highlighting that.
There was one time when I interviewed for a job, and the critical feedback I got was, you did a great job, but we noticed that you're using a lot of jargon. And I said, can you give me an example of this jargon? And the example this person gave me was, well, you said white privilege, right? And so that notion that even as anyone who's in higher education, well, first of all, if you're doing social justice work, if you can't name that, that's problematic, A. But B, that's sort of standard vernacular at this point, right? To be able to talk about systems of oppression, privilege, power, that should actually be our standard vocabulary. And when we look at, particularly in the classroom, there are ways in which white privilege can show up, right? It can show up in our interactions with our students. It could show up in the scholarship or lack thereof that includes scholars of color. It can show up in our pedagogy, in how we teach and how we don't teach particular ideologies or even particular frameworks or perspectives. And I think what comes up a lot in the classroom and was illuminated by Emily is how we interact with our students on the one-on-one. In those mentoring conversations, in those advising conversations, when we're brainstorming theses ideas, for instance, and discounting, for example, scholarship that comes primarily from authors of color or who aren't from the canon. So ways in which white privilege shows up doesn't show up as white privilege and this neon light, but in our everyday, in those microaggressions and ways in which we're not even conscious, it can show up. I remember teaching a women in leadership class, and there was a call out from colleagues to do more and include more scholarship from trans authors. And I looked at my own syllabus and I thought, I actually don't have any authors who identify as trans. So even like to do the work is a lot of sweat equity, but in the end, we all benefit when we do that work, because it shouldn't just be students of color having these conversations. It should actually be part of our classroom and part of our pedagogy writ large.
Take one more question.
I'm sorry.
At 5 after, and so that we can move on to our concurrent sessions.
I'll toss up the mic. Just real quickly, I think, Cynthia, to your point when you brought that up, by the way, my name is Dale Trevino. I'm Associate Dean at the Graduate School at Princeton University. And one of the things that I have a particular interest in relating to this particular dilemma we're in is how are we training our future faculty members, right? So at the graduate level, we're preparing those for the professoriate, and what are we doing, and what is our, and I look at my colleague here, Brown, an institution like the McGraw and other places for centers that are really there about helping those individuals that are going to be going into the classroom and teaching. So this should be part of that training, right? It's not just the scholarly work, which is so critical. I mean, we have that body of literature, your work, everything is contributing to it. But I think what we're missing and tying it to is, what does that mean for you being in the classroom, so that you're not making these statements about how you personally feel about the border, right? And where there's a time and a place for that. But what's your responsibility in teaching your students? And I think that's a place that's, in terms of graduate education, that I'm particularly hoping that's promising, and hopefully we'll see some changes.
Hi, I have a question. The comparison between Brown and Harvard, and your wonderful discussion around the underpinnings of this need to integrate the differences that come into our universities. Could you speak to the issue of the historical cultures of the institutions, how we be there? Because I look at white privilege as how children are socialized and grow up, and the cultural differences in the socializations we adapt to who we are in the environment. So white children are taught to be curious, and they're entitled to receive the benefit of that curiosity, whereas some other children may be taught it's not safe to extend yourself into the environment. So could you speak to Brown's culture and Harvard's culture? I've been at both places, and there's distinctions. And how does that affect the way we approach this agenda, the culture of the institution?
So you're saying, so I guess, let me just make sure I understand. You're saying that Brown and Harvard might have different cultures, ways of socializing students, and that will then in turn affect their kind of perspectives.
The way we socialize faculty, what it means to be here,
Yeah.
what gets rewarded in a larger sense, not specifically to the diversity issue, but it affects it.
Yeah. So, so I'm not sure. I mean, I can tell you. So, in terms of faculty, I can say we don't get a kind of formal training. You know, when you arrive, most universities you don't get a formal training when you arrive. I'm not sure what that is at Brown, and I should say I don't know what it is at Harvard today. I know that what it was when I joined the faculty. But I think there is often a culture of your department or of your, you know, for me it's the Graduate School of Education, and I think those vary a lot by department, right? So I think it would be hard for me to imagine like that kind of comment coming out of a kind of faculty of maybe I'm going to be biased and talk about my two fields of sociology and education, and maybe political science is a different kind of culture, and the sciences might have a different kind of culture entirely. But I think that there are cultures of disciplines that permeate these departments, and that probably shape the expectations, right? I think that, for example, our dean has sort of for the last 3 years had this theme of fulfilling the promise of diversity, and has had a real emphasis both in terms of our teaching and student and faculty discussions, really kind of pushing. In faculty meetings, we're going to have the Committee on Diversity run a workshop, and this expectation that we are talking and thinking about these issues. That is, that doesn't exist probably in most places, right? But that when that expectation is set, that shapes the way you think about your own teaching, right? And that, might give you pause before you make a comment like that about, well, wait a minute, so I do think that we can shape cultures in very kind of in ways that are important, and that will kind of shape the way people think a little bit about their teaching.
My name is Anissa Ali. I'm a Brown alum, and for 17 years I worked at an elite higher ed institution in the Midwest, to go unnamed at the moment, Just saying, not in Evanston, I'll leave that. Back to your question about what to do about this, I think that what you're describing is various forms of resistance, right? And so while our focus of the conversation so far has been on sort of explicit curriculum, I think we're positioned to take advantage of the body of research on implicit bias and now implicit bias mitigation in decision-making. No, we're not going to be able to make the faculty take it, but if we consider that as an essential component of a liberal arts education, if critical thinking is a part of the expectation that our students will come away with that, then ensuring that our students are exposed to it, it's research-based, there's considering how many decisions we'll make in a lifetime. It's a life skill for personal and professional, whether you don't give a hoot about social justice, but you want to break through the ceiling in your investing in the stock market, whatever, it's going to benefit you to understand that. So I think really taking advantage of that research that's available to us and embracing it, and I'm seeing that at some of the traditional. So now I'm spending some time working with first gens through public commuter campuses, and I think that that's something that we could take advantage of as well.
And we'll take one final question and then
Thank you.
final comments, both for Anissa and for Rafael.
Thanks, Lisa. My name is Rafael Zapata, and I'm coming across town from Providence College. Not as a lead, nowhere near as the resources, and I think that's the key piece in order to do this. But we're working on a space, and I'll talk about this later, and we're trying to navigate the tensions between the needs to promote a more progressive social justice framework and also getting people to the table. I think what's happening here at Brown, so many things are complementary. I think of the work of CSRA and how structural racism works. That's incredibly important to supplement the work of what's now the Center for Students of Color, because oftentimes these spaces are the only spaces in which students can have these conversations with any sort of depth. And in that case, those spaces become marginalized themselves, and they don't really disrupt the power relations within the institution. They're viewed as less academic, they're viewed as less rigorous, and that's the currency of these institutions. And moving toward a more, the learning piece, the engagement piece, the rigor piece, that's consistent with the values, but that do upset these power relations, and it speaks to this notion of insubordinate spaces, right? That unsettle power relations by their very being. And the question becomes, how do we get people to encounter those spaces as opposed to, I'm going to the Third World Center, I might not be a person of color, or I might not be connected to a community of color, but I'm gonna go. Or this is difficult for me, as we know students of color, when they engage these questions, it can be extremely challenging, but worth it. But nevertheless, how do we, it's really about creating multiple spaces that students can encounter. And I'll just leave it at that.
Some final comments from the panelists?
I've been thinking a little bit about the culture of higher education, specifically like liberal education or elite liberal education at Brown, and like the independence that we have here, and how that serves to create bigger inequality among student expectations and realities. Because like independence is really valuable and empowering for students who already have the experiences or skills or capital to be able to go to office hours and like be able to pursue and have the initiative or like experience with the entitlement that it takes to be able to take those opportunities. But if you don't come from a space where you're used to feeling that entitled, then the culture of liberal education and of that independence can really serve to like disempower you in a lot of ways.
So to Rafael's last point, at least with the student centers, what I've noticed is that the students and the administrators and the faculty partners who are involved are unapologetic in their commitment to those communities. And I think that's critical for students and the community to see this unapologetic, resilient commitment. But they can't do that work alone, right? So if we can't get people into the spaces, how does our work become infused and integrated within the wider campus community? So what strategic partnerships do we need to forge so that we are building institutional capacity for multiple conversations to happen in multiple spaces? This is just one center. These are just 4 centers. The work can't happen in isolation in those 4 centers. In fact, the onus of the responsibility for that work to be infused is on all of our shoulders. So thinking through how to forge those strategic partnerships is part of what these centers, I hope, do, and do, I should say, because that work cannot happen in isolation.
Thank you. So let me just close by saying that, I am a researcher, and I really believe in the power of research and evidence in promoting these conversations. And that's in part why I wrote this book, to make clear, like, these are the implications of the way that we're talking and thinking about diversity. And for people, all of you to then think about, well, how might we do this differently and more productively and ways to further whatever goals that we have. And I think, when I think about like the classroom, I also think, an emphasis on, and I think the implicit bias research, I'm not a psychologist, I'm a sociologist, but what I love about that research is that it's incontrovertible, right? You go and take that. There's implicit bias basically measures your reaction times, right, to different associations based on race or gender or, nationality. And it's hard to say that it doesn't exist when you see it, right, when there's evidence. And so I think that research can be very powerful in especially convincing the skeptical, right? Convincing that skeptical audience, right, of that bias exists or that these are real issues that really need addressing, right? And I think, and to your point, I think then we start with you kind of start with the willing. You build your alliance and you move forward. You create a culture, right? And so maybe that faculty member doesn't join when you say, here, we're gonna have a faculty discussion group about diversity and race or equity, but all that faculty members, colleagues are talking and thinking about this issue and it spills over in a conversation and it's sort of, to me, it then builds a culture and it trickles, eventually sort of things start to shift. Slowly, but I think in important ways. And so I do think if we start with research, build up, and focus on, your willing audience, right? Because that exists as well. I think in my own institution, we started a discussion group on race and racism, and it was voluntary. But I think among the faculty who came, it was very powerful, right? And then those faculty then bring it to other faculty, and I think it again creates this culture. And that, I think, will also addresses this kind of marginalization issue as well. So, I think it's really important work, and obviously I think it's important because I wrote a book about it. But I also think it's I think there are a lot of possibilities, and I think there are so many. I think institutions, especially when you look at the UK, you think, okay, we're a little further along, but I think that we have some institutional capacity in the United States, and we can build on that. And conferences like this, where you kind of build alliances across universities as well, I think are really important. So let me just say thank you to both of you so much. I really appreciate your comments.
Thank our panelists again.